Strong Vincent is defending a hillside. This hillside here. He's with the 83rd Pennsylvania, and he's facing Longstreet's men, Alabamians and Virginians, that are racing up the hillside and trying to break his lines. He knows that he has to hold. He knows that he has to rally his men. And he's about to get the test of his life. If that story sounds familiar, well, it is. Sounds a lot like Gettysburg. But we're not at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We're at Gaines Mill, in a small patch of land here, a hillside in front of Bosun's Creek. This would be the place that Strong Vincent would get his first real taste and test in the American Civil War. And that test of his leadership right here on this hillside would lead him to his fate in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Born in 1837, Strong Vincent would take the name Strong from his mother's maiden name. And he was a quick learner, very quick-witted kid, had a bit of a temper. As he was growing up, everybody knew Strong as being a very smart man, very smart indeed. And he ends up going to college in Connecticut. His parents sent him there for an education. While he's there, he would meet his future wife, Elizabeth, and an altercation there would ensue as someone had insulted his future bride-to-be. As a result, Strong leaves Connecticut. After living in another small town in Pennsylvania, Strong Vincent ends up in Erie, and that's as a result of his family having to move. His father has an iron foundry, and for some time before he goes to college, Strong ends up working in that iron foundry with his father. It's kind of a hard way to earn a living, but his family ends up being better off than a lot of families in the area. When fighting breaks out in 1861, Strong Vincent immediately signs up and he joins, and he gets commissioned to fight in the Civil War. Now, not very many people can say that they went to Trinity and got into an altercation, and as a result, ended up in Harvard. Strong Vincent was a pretty smart guy, but he definitely ended up in Harvard as a result of an altercation. Otherwise, he would not have been there. But he goes there to study law, and he graduates in the middle of his class in the late 1850s. Afterwards, he moves back to home, and he ends up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and he ends up with a title or a job title of reading law in a law office downtown Erie, Pennsylvania. And for some time, he does that. But then the American Civil War breaks out, and he has a decision to make. So he decides to marry his sweetheart from college, Elizabeth, and they get married right before he signs up and moves off with the 83rd Pennsylvania. And that's how he gets his start in the American Civil War. He decides he needs to do something, and so he does. Now, all throughout the American Civil War, in the early days, the 83rd Pennsylvania is involved in a lot of fighting. And they're involved in that 7 days campaign, which is what Gaines' Mill is a part of. This is a 7 days battle. Strong Vincent really hasn't made much of a name for himself, although he is seen as a strict disciplinarian. He's seen as someone that is black and white and by the book. Kind of, go figure, a lawyer would be by the book. But he takes to being a soldier pretty easily, considering the fact that he's never had any military experience prior to the American Civil War. And throughout the campaigns leading up to 7 days, he's a pretty good soldier. But unfortunately for him, before he gets to Gaines' Mill, he ends up coming down with a bad case of dysentery, and it weakens him pretty bad. He's sick for most of the fights leading up to Gaines' Mill, and even here at Gaines' Mill, he is pretty bad off. He's weak, very weak. But then all of a sudden, his commanding officer goes down and is taken out. Somebody's got to step up and do something, and Strong Vincent would become that somebody. Right here, where I'm standing right now. As the Boatswain's Creek curves back around, the 83rd Pennsylvania is here, and Alabama is coming up in this direction, and they're fighting, facing them, going up this gentle slope to the hillside, heading in that direction. All day long, it's been a back and forth seesaw action across these fields. Strong Vincent is here, simply trying to keep his lines together, because other lines are faltering and men are running. And he gives inspiration to the men that are around him. So the 83rd Pennsylvania is right back there. And they're in trouble. Colonel John McClane has just been shot. He would subsequently die. Strong Vincent rides up to the lines as fast as he can, seeing that his men are confused and that they are all kind of disorganized. They're falling apart here. He takes the reins as the leader of the 83rd Pennsylvania that day as a result of John McClane. And he would go on to become the colonel of that unit and be in charge of those men for some of the deadliest conflicts throughout the American Civil War leading up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Strong Vincent would be no stranger at all to fighting. He would see some of the hardest fighting of his lifetime in places like Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. When Strong Vincent arrives in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, it is said that fate put him in that place for that time. And some even think he's the unsung hero of Little Round Top. Without Strong Vincent and his actions, 20th Maine's not going to be there. Without Strong Vincent and his actions, the military crest is not going to be found, with a fallback point for his men on top of that hill in case something bad happens. Without Strong Vincent making the decision to put those men there and to guide and lead the entire time, right up until the point that he's shot, a lot of things aren't going to turn out the way that they turned out. But there's no movie about Strong Vincent. There's no book written by Michael Shara that talks heavily about Strong Vincent. They talk about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain as if Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was the savior of Gettysburg. In reality, a lot of big pieces came together. When this army shows up in Gettysburg, it comes there as a forced reconnaissance. The men that are sent forward are there to test the lines of the Confederates and to try to seek out where those lines are, how heavily entrenched they are, or where they're traveling from, or anything at all. They don't have a map of Gettysburg. They don't have a map of Adams County. They do not know what to expect in that area. And General Meade doesn't even want to fight there. He's on Big Pipe Creek, and he's got his men and his positions lined up to perfectly defend Big Pipe Creek. But instead, General Reynolds makes his way out there after Buford has the first confrontation in Gettysburg. Reynolds makes some questionable moves while he's out there, and he doesn't pass along pertinent information. And therefore, a general engagement is brought on in Gettysburg that Meade doesn't want. This causes a lot of confusion and a lot of miscommunication. That's the reason why Strong Vincent ends up having to make the decision that he makes. Strong Vincent, upon entering Gettysburg, realizes that he's in a bad position. Meade had ridden out to the area where Little Round Top was, and he had seen the action, and he'd been there since early in the morning on July 2nd, and probably late in the evening on July 1st. Meade had been looking at the terrain and trying to determine where he needed to place his men, and he was kind of forced into the position that he was in. General Meade did not want to be in that position. He did not want to fight that fight there. He saw Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill as being a very defendable position, but what he didn't like was that ridge line leading up to Little Round Top. But he also saw Little Round Top as the place that he needed to have. He had to have that position. Otherwise, the line would be turned. And that's what he was worried about the entire time, his line being turned. Now, from the location that I'm going to right now, Geary was out here initially holding this spot. Dan Sickles receives orders to come out here and put his men in the same place that Geary had his men. Dan Sickles claims that he sent his staff out here and then eventually made his way out here too. And when he got to this position, he realized that this was not an advantageous spot. He had requested more confirmation on where he was supposed to go, and that he wasn't clear on his orders. So now forever focused on this position that he's in, where he really wants to get his men out to the peach orchard, or to that high ground that we're talking about, Dan Sickles sends back wanting confirmation of orders. George Meade sends his son out to give him that confirmation. When his son gets to the camp, they tell him that the general is resting. It's a superiority move, really. Captain Meade tries to tell him what the orders are, and he's really not listening to it. He asks for confirmation again. George Meade himself eventually has to come out to the lines to talk to him about where he's at. But once he gets those orders, he then asks if he has the authority to take up ground where he sees fit within the vicinity of his location. And he was given that authority, but he took liberty with that authority, and he moved his men so far out front that he ends up creating not only a salient, but several gaps in the Union line, and he leaves the high ground over here at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and all of that completely open. And that's what creates the havoc that we have at the Devil's Den, the wheat field, and the peach orchard. Had it not been for Dan Sickles moving his men out there, the Confederates might have swept across that field and taken that left wheel and hit the end of the Union line and maybe swept them off the field here at Gettysburg. It might have been a different story. So, from one point of view, Dan Sickles did not follow orders and created a situation that General Meade had to fix. But from another point of view, Dan Sickles brought on the fight, and he might have accidentally caused a situation that saved this flank over here. there's really no better place to tell the story with the battle orientation than right here on top of this monument. Now, for orientation, off down in this direction over here is where the 20th Maine is. The 20th Maine kind of angles down this way and then back like this. Then coming back up in this position over here is the 83rd Pennsylvania. Swinging back in this direction where I'm at right now is the 44th New York. Then the 16th Michigan is off in this direction over here, followed by the 140th New York, the 91st Pennsylvania, the 146th New York, who we talked about in an earlier video, 155th Pennsylvania, and they're all looping back around this direction over here on the top of Little Round Top. And from up here, you can clearly see that outcropping of rocks. That's Devil's Den for reference. The slaughter pen runs down through here. And then the fields that the Confederates are traversing are from across there. You see that tree line off in the distance. They're coming out of that tree line and they're making their way over here. And off in this wooded lot is where 47th Alabama and the 15th Alabama under law are actually coming up this direction. And then you have the 4th Alabama rolling up through here. The 5th Texas, 4th Texas, 48th Alabama, and 44th are off in this direction and then kind of swinging this way as they're coming up towards Hawks Ridge and Devil's Den. What death more glorious can any man desire than to die on the soil of old Pennsylvania, fighting for that flag? Those were the words of Strong Vincent going into Pennsylvania, headed towards his fate, headed towards his glory, if you will. Those words would be prophetic for him, really. He's sitting on his horse with his staff there, and he removes the cap from his head, and he called the band to play Yankee Doodle. And as the band plays Yankee Doodle, the colors pass by, and he utters those words out loud to everyone so that they can hear it. And it brings cheers, and his men are very inspired. And some say that the reason why a lot of men fought in that army so hard in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was because a lot of them were from Pennsylvania. They were from that soil. They fought the hardest that they ever fought right there in that area. And it turned out to be a victory. But for Strong Vincent, it would turn out to be his last fight. Strong Vincent, without any orders, any real orders at all, gets to Little Round Top, and he sets up a military circle, or a military crest, if you will, which is basically a lower position there on Little Round Top for his men to hunker behind and prepare for the enemy to come up. And then he rides along the lines talking to other commanders, other leaders, about the position that he's in and their positions as well, and how they're going to work together. He's a very, very good leader, very good at communicating. The fallback position is just behind them. So whenever the enemy comes up and attacks them, if they have to fall back, they fall back to the highest point. They're not running away from their position on top, and they're not scattering down the hill. It's a very smart move. It's textbook, really. Then the fight ensues, and it is hot and furious. It is going back and forth all afternoon, to the point to where men are running out of ammunition, and they're having to take cartridges from the boxes of the soldiers around them, the wounded soldiers and the dead soldiers from both sides, whether it's Confederate or Union. Eventually, Strong Vincent stands on top of a rock, directing men without any care for what happens to himself. And then a bullet comes up and hits him, takes him completely out. Strong Vincent would end up being carried off the field to the Jacob Weichert farm. On July 2nd, he would be promoted to Brigadier General. On July 7th, Strong Vincent would die. He did not die a glorious death. He died trying to recover from his wounds and weakly muttering the Lord's Prayer. That was the end of a very bright light in this world. But he would lead to him being forever remembered for his actions there at Gettysburg. And his rock is still there today. He's buried in Erie, Pennsylvania in the family plot. What a life it was. You know, stories like these, even about major people that history writes about, like Strong Vincent, it's stories like these that make up the entire story of the Civil War. It's the reason why we do these videos, why we travel all these miles and communicate with all these historians. We want to tell the whole story and not leave people out. But unfortunately, there's countless dead that are out there on these fields somewhere, and their story's never been told because maybe they didn't know how to write, or maybe their family members kept the heirlooms and they were lost with time. But we'll keep digging. We'll try to find more stories for you. And we hope you enjoyed this story about Strong Vincent, the hero, the true savior of Little Round Top, Gettysburg. Until next time, this is History with Waffles.